All right, beautiful friends, we have made it to the month of April. We got through March mayhem, March madness. I don't even know what to call March. You know what, February too, but March was super intense. And we had that last eclipse in the sign of Aries. Thank God for that. And we had Neptune ingress into the sign of Aries. And the way that I'm going to organize this talk for the month of April is that I'm going to come back every week whenever we have some intense and prominent alignments and discuss those. So for today, I'm going to discuss the transits one specific day because we have a lot happening and very prominent alignments, which will fall on April 4th. And we'll discuss those, and then I will come back. There's another set of conjunctions and alignments later in the week. I will come back to talk about that too. And before starting, if you like this video and the contents of this channel, please like, comment, and subscribe. And you know I love your comments, and my comments get a little long in commenting back. Excuse that, but I like having a discussion with you guys. And if you want to know more about my services, go to parisayazi.com. There you can find my reading services, courses, archetypal life narrative counseling, and etc. And without further ado, let's get into the first week for the month of April. First of all, on April 4th, actually, you know what? Before saying anything, we should always take into consideration the phases of the moon. And this is actually a very good time to start tracking the moon and its phases after this eclipse. Not only starting from the first sign, which is Aries, it was also an eclipse season. And a lot of people like to think that the eclipses start to have their implications, feelings, or the way they impel us 3 weeks before and 3 weeks after. Not really. If you actually start paying attention, things are being triggered to the next set of eclipses. That's when this eclipse is actually over. And by tracking the moon and the movement of the sun, you can learn a lot about what is happening and what's being encompassed in the alignments that are coming up. When I do the transits from here on, I want to mention what the moon's phases and how all of these alignments are fitting into it. So when we start this first week of April, on April 4th, we have a first quarter waxing moon, and we got to remember the crap show that's been going on in Cancer. We have Mars there that was retrograding, now it's direct. The moon is sitting there and it's having a lot to say with all the other alignments that are happening on that day. So this is a moon that's gaining its light, right? That's the first quarter from the new moon that occurred in the sign of Aries with the eclipse. And on April 4th, we have Mercury at 27 degrees conjunct Rāhu North Node in the sign of Pisces. We have Saturn at 24 degrees in the sign of Pisces, sextiling Uranus at that same degree. We have Mars at 24 degrees of Cancer, also sextiling Uranus in the sign of Taurus. And these are the alignments for April 4th, and they're quite significant. So I'm just going to go through all of this and tell you guys the narrative of it and how we can interpret it. So in some ways, with that moon that's gaining its light, it almost feels as if some veil is being lifted very slowly, but is starting to lift. And I would say not to an extent where we're going to have clear answer about things, but we're going to be able to formulate more clear questions as to how it is that we need to proceed from here on forth. So in general, this is not a week for really bold declarations of this is who I am, this is what I'm going to do, this is how it ought to be done. It's more like incremental moments of recognition within ourselves that's bringing us to alignment. And I've been saying this in other videos, so by the time we get to about June, we have very good clarity about many things and we can actually start our sprint forward. But for now, we're just walking our way up to the podium, to use that same metaphor in the last video that I used. And you know, if you think about it, when we go back to that solar eclipse that happened in the sign of Aries at that 9-degree mark, it was a moment of culmination and initiation. So a lot of things were wrapping themselves up and then new things are being initiated. That's what I was saying. We have to wait until the next eclipse, which will then be in Virgo and Pisces, and we're done with Aries, but there's an unfolding that's happening right now. So we're coming to a better grasp of how do we do things? Who am I? What is this notion of selfhood that I have? And you know, we have Neptune now there too. There's a sense of ideological background to it too, what we truly value. Even the most abstract, we're trying to make it tangible. Well, we don't have a clear answer yet as to how do we do all of these things. And I think it's quite poignant that Venus and Mercury are going to eventually come back into the sign of Aries where action's being initiated. That's why I'm saying we got to get into like end of May towards June, then we have clarity about how it is we're going to do things and what we're doing. So it's almost like the month of April is intention setting month. We're trying to get some sense of clarity of how to do things. And that moon, which is growing, it's illuminating. The moon represents the mind, right? It was eclipse. We had an eclipse. It was a solar eclipse, but the moon was involved in that new moon. So there was a sense of darkness. There was the light of the mind, the light of the consciousness, and how we're able to feel and think was obscured. But now with this growing light, we're getting a sense of clarity again. And the beauty of this is that it's happening in the sign of Cancer. This is moon's own sign. So we're getting our internal self, our internal processing, our emotions, the way that we are devotional in our hearts, what we are devoted to, it's getting illuminated. You know, sometimes we get so many pressures from the external world of this is how you ought to be. These are the expectations. You feel as if you're being punished for wanting to have a self-expression because it is not corresponding to the social norms that you're interacting with. The world can make us feel very small in who we want to be and how we want to be. But with this moon in the sign of Cancer too, it's allowing us to see our own internal landscape. And this is very important after this eclipse because the pot really got stirred. And talking about beginnings and endings, they always bring confusion. You know, we always have a sense of relief that something has ended. But in that relief, there's a split-minded thing of anxiety because what next? Because that's how we human beings operate. We can't just be happy with endings. We expect that if something ends, something else has to start. I remember my university days. I was so excited about graduating finally, but there was this like inner angst about what next. So that eclipse, it may have broad endings, but it's bringing that angst of what next. And a good place to start, the blessing here is that we get to start with our internal landscape, do a self-inventory, and to understand where we stand at this moment, how we feel, what we need. These are very important factors. But there's always a but. It seems these days there's always a but when it comes to the transits. The but here is that Mars is sitting in the sign of Cancer. Even though on April 4th, they're still somewhat far apart from each other, but they're still occupying the same sign. So it's almost like having a roommate. You have to kind of, even if you live on different floors, let's say you own a house, you rented the top part of your house, you still have to make sure your music is not too loud. You're not being obnoxious. So it affects you. The presence of another planet with another planet, even if they are very far, they are still sharing that space. So they have a certain amount of effect on each other. They're leaving a kind of a mood or a mode in that space. And of course, Cancer is not where Mars loves to be. Mars is debilitated here, and it's been for a long time. And you know, the crazy thing about Mars in the sign of Cancer is like, Mars is already impulsive if you put Mars in its own sign of, let's say, Aries. But when you put Mars in the sign of Cancer, there's so much agitation there because it can't do what it wants to do that it actually becomes more impulsive in a lot of ways. But then being there for so long too, our Mars, the Mars within us, the drive within us, that masculine principle that wants to be inceptive within us, it really wanted to act in many different ways in the past few months. And we constantly found out that, holy smokes, like there's no means, there's no way to act this out. So we have become more patient in a lot of ways. We're learning what it means to care about things because things have been breaking apart. We act, we move, and we create this jolt in our environment that things get destroyed. So we're learning that, okay, I need to be more mindful the way that I exert my energy and do things. And we're learning how to not be just so reactive based on our instinct that I feel like this needs to be done, therefore I need to do it right now. And we also got to remember like that Saturn-Mars trining, Saturn being in the sign of Pisces and Mars being in the sign of Cancer. The Mars in us is really learning what it means to be patient. And it almost feels that when Moon comes into the sign of Cancer where Mars is, it's almost like a mother figure coming now to create or to give some bit of nurturance for all this self-restraint. It's exhausting to continuously repress and suppress one's actions. This is one way of getting severe anxiety. You want to act, but you don't have the means to act. You have this dream and you want to initiate what you want to do, but you don't have enough support to do it. So it becomes a lot of repression and shoving it down, and this creates a lot of anxiety. And with the moon coming here in its own sign, it's almost as if it's mothering Mars for a second. And it's giving Mars that light that it needs. And it's asking it like a kind mother. Okay, you're almost into the sign of Leo. You really want to initiate. I can see it. You've been holding back. You've been patient. But can we sit and feel it out and talk about it to understand where we're starting from? Because a lot of things have changed. Moon is having this very emotional and a devotional conversation with Mars in terms of asking it, from what emotional truth do you want to start? From what emotional truth do you want to act? What is your emotional truth? What is your inner truth? And because this moon is gaining its light, so it's allowing us to have that internal insight. This moon is letting us know where Mars in general was letting us know where our frailty is, where we fall short, where our inner content does not match the external world and how we want to act in it. And now with the moon coming here with a bit of nurturance too, especially after this eclipse out of Mars' sign, it's asking Mars, what of these frailties, what of these inadequacies are you constantly projecting outwards? How do we need to do things differently? And I'm saying that the moon's, it's more like in a mode of asking questions rather than giving it to Mars in terms of answer, because this is still a moon that it's in its first quarter phase. It's almost as if they're brainstorming together. But the moon here also has the effect of holding Mars responsible for the things that it wants to initiate. And Mars really wants to, when Mars gets into the sign of Leo, right away, it's going to have an aspect with Pluto. So it's going to be intense, like all that repressed, all that just contain it within. It's going to be an explosive moment. So this is actually a very good time for us to do a self-inventory so that when we do take that act, we don't get the typical Mars opposing Pluto kind of a outcome, which is devastating. It can be violent. If we can align the inner and understand how we are now at this time located in the world and within ourselves, then we'll know how to position ourselves too. And maybe that action with that conjunction of Pluto is talking about our intensity and our passion for it, rather than the way that we're going to overdo it and be destructive. But we'll talk about that Mars-Pluto opposition as the time comes. So now I'm going to go in order of the conjunctions, the way they're going to happen on April 4th. So the first one that we're going to get is Mercury conjunct Rahu in the sign of Pisces. I'm not going to talk so much about this because if I'm not mistaken, I made like a 40-minute video about Mercury conjunct Rahu and then in the sign of Pisces. So you guys can go back and to just understand what this conjunction, this connection between Rāhu North Node and Mercury is like, what it's about symbolically, and how to interpret it. And something worth remembering is that this is happening at 27 degrees of Pisces. And what's important to remember, Mercury is going to station at 26. And because North Node Rahu is fairly slow moving, these two guys are going to be in a 1-degree conjunction until April 13th. That's not a short amount of time for intellect and the mind to be captured by one planet. I mean, think about the intellect, the mind, or thinking process. It's like this: left, right, and center thoughts are coming and thoughts going. So if we get into that mode of obsessing or being very compulsively stuck on one thought, this can create a very devastating momentum. So we have to become super uber aware of what our mind is doing, how Mercury is behaving at this time. And this is going to be Mercury's second conjunction with the North Node. And technically its second and third conjunction is the same thing, because I was saying it's just 1 degree of separation. When Mercury stations to go direct, and it's going to go over Rahu by that 1 degree mark, and then it'll go into 28 degrees. So it is a triple pass technically, but it feels like one clear pass the first time, and then second and third are just blurred into each other. So this second and third is acting like an echo chamber. So it's like Rahu's just amplifying all the debilitated ways of Mercury in the sign of Pisces. And as Mercury makes that 1 degree distance, which is not out of the grip of that graha. Graha means planet in Indian astrology, and graha, the meaning of it are the grabbers. So Rahu has Mercury grabbed. And it's just amplifying all the ways that Mercury struggles in general in the sign of Pisces. And one of the effects of this is one of the worst things that can happen to us human beings. We have a thought, we devour a thought, but we don't digest the thoughts. So we get indigestion of thoughts and thinking. And when Mercury and Rahu are stuck in this kind of a echo chamber, this is one of the things that could come out of this. Unprocessed thoughts, unrefined thoughts, overthinking, over analyzing. It's almost like having our minds just the mind is just spinning. It's like, you know, if you've ever been drunk and you try to have a coherent and a clear thought without those lags and the weirdness that comes in between it, this is the kind of feeling you get with Mercury stuck with Rahu. It wants to have a clear thought, but is being intoxicated by all the possibilities that it could have. For example, let's keep thinking about the imagined outcomes. It's the means to confusion when you get these two planets conjunct. And what comes out of this when we're in this state of mind? A lot of times we don't have clear thoughts. And if we don't have clear thoughts, we don't have clear actions. And this gets us into trouble. We miscommunicate with other people. And what ends up happening is that we start to have just massive cognitive overwhelm. It's like too many meanings, too many voices, too many thoughts all simultaneously running in the mind. And yet, because there are too many of them, actually, none of them are reliable. And they're not reliable because we're not digesting the thoughts. You know, we might have a thought about how I want to do things, how I want to go about things, how I want to incorporate things into other things because it's in the sign of Pisces. But we need a sense of clarity of thought to know what the application of it externally in the world is. So Mercury here with Rahu is really losing the power of discernment, differentiation, and distinction. Everything's just being blurred into each other. And you know, what Rahu's doing here, Rahu is a malefic, but I would argue all the malefics are doing this in a lot of ways. They're showing us our weaknesses. They make us weak, but they're also showing us our weaknesses. So Rahu here is showing Mercury where its own intellect has reached its threshold, and the intellect is now collapsing on itself. And as other manifestations you can get from Rahu and Mercury, it can indicate massive paranoia because of that lack of discernment and differentiation and the inability to do reality checking, really believing our own thoughts. This is one of the craziest things that we do as human beings. We have an emotion that's very intense, or we have a thought, and without examination of it, without doing some inventory of it, we believe it. And almost forgetting in that moment that thoughts and emotions are transient. They're showing us something about the condition of the now, but they are not telling us something about the condition and the totality of our lives. So when Mercury is here, because it's related to our thinking, we might believe things as facts, as stable truth with a capital T that runs through all times, without examining and saying that, hey, I'm actually having this thought because I'm having back pain. That's why I hate that person. But on a normal day, you're not fond of the person, but you don't hate them. So these are the weird modes that Mercury can create. We can start to have a lot of projections too with this conjunction. So the inadequacies that we have, the way that we communicate it to other people, we're projecting it onto them as if it's their quality. You know, you see this sometimes, like some people will use the same word over and over, and then you start to pay attention. They describe every person that way. How could it be that every person does this thing to you? How is it that every person has this negative quality? And when you start paying attention to the person, this is actually the negative quality of the person themselves, where they are projecting it on other people. So that thinking process that's required to self-reflect is not happening in that case. And with Rahu Mercury, this could very well be the case. And of course, Mercury Rahu overanalysis to paralysis, very common. So in this moment, we have to become very aware of the kinds of narratives that we have and how much of these narratives are actually these mental mirage that we have in our mind. And we all do this. None of us are exempt from this. And another thing, I was going to say something else, but I just remembered this. When we have mental overwhelm, we put ourselves in a state of paralysis usually. This is how it works. When the external world becomes overwhelming, we put ourselves on hibernate mode. So one of the ways that you can tell that, hey, this is a Mercury Rahu thing happening, and especially Mercury in the sign of Pisces, there's a need to disengage from other people and the need to disengage from actions, activities. And the way that this unfolds itself, I just have this intuition that I shouldn't act right now. Examine that. Because this conjunction, because of the overwhelm, can actually create a lot of avoidance in a lot of ways too. And you know, that whole discernment of fact and fiction with Mercury, even if Rahu's not there, is a prominent theme when in the sign of Pisces. So as an example, someone might send you a message, or you might see something on social media, just to give a very mundane, benign example, and it just sends you into a spiral. It's like, I can't believe this person did this. How stupid are they? How could they think like that? Start ruminating in the mind and becoming very reactive. And if you pay attention, when I was saying that whole narrative thing, what are we doing in that moment? We're taking like a couple of sentences and we're building a whole narrative around who the person is, what the situation is, who I think I am, and how unfair and unjust I think that is. So these are the things that we need to become aware of. And we are really supposed to take this time right now to do that internal self-examination and that self-inventory so that we can start initiating and acting and being active in the world again. So I'm going to leave off Mercury Rahu here. I encourage you, as I said earlier, to go check out that other video, Mercury conjunct Rahu, because I talk a lot about symbolism of Rāhu North Node and Mercury, and then what does that even mean when they combine. So for the next conjunction, we're going to go to Saturn, sextile Uranus in the sign of Taurus, where they're both at 24 degrees. You guys know what I'm going to do now. I'm just going to take a short break, get a little water. I'll be right back. Okay, I'm back, and I just committed a cardinal sin of recording. I got coffee instead of water. Mars made me do it. Mars represents coffee. Everything pungent is Mars. And spicy. Hot and spicy. Some pungent stuff's actually Saturn too. But I'm really getting off point here. Okay, let's get back into Saturn sextiling Uranus at 24 degrees. Now, first thing we got to remember, this is a rare alignment because they're both super slow moving planets. So they will take a long time to sextile again. And they are such a contradictory planet to each other that normally, like, let's say if they were squaring, is like, good God, something's coming to its tension point, like opposites at full degree of friction and tension, something's going to break. But a sextile is saying that we're trying to work through some things. Sextiles almost have a Venusian quality of softening things up, making things possible. So this tension point now comes to a point of possibly being resolved. That's one way of looking at it. And we also have to remember, Saturn is softening up in the sign of Pisces. You know, one of the mantras for Saturn's referred to as Sham. And when Saturn's creating a lot of obstacles, Saturn as Sham, which is a female figure, is portrayed as flowing river of waters. So if you're stuck, this mantra, I'll put the mantra in the description below, both in Sanskrit and English. But this mantra is you asking Sham, like you're an old dry tree in a desert, okay? There's actually a tree, there's tree type called Sham, and it's a tree that lives in a desert on minimal water. So you're asking Saturn, Sham, to give you this flowing water that it has so that you can get nourished. So Saturn in the sign of Pisces is not as dry as it would be in other signs. So it has a little bit of flexibility. Saturn itself wants moistness to remedy that dryness and that coldness that it has. So in the sign of Pisces, it's almost as if Saturn itself is getting kind of nourished too. But don't ask, when Saturn and Moon conjunct, Moon is a water element, is a totally different story. It's like Saturn was drying up Moon and making it suffer. But in the sign of Pisces, because of its moistness, that fixed, rigid nature of Saturn becomes a little bit more movable. It's still, you can't push too far, you're going to break things. But there's lubrication almost. You can look at it like that. It's still about rules and the limitations and the boundaries that it sets, but it has a bit of flexibility in it. And Uranus in Taurus has a lot of contradictions in it too. Uranus is trying to break from the set structures. Even if you look at it in the solar system, there is Saturn as the last traditional planet. Uranus is right after it. Saturn's like, this is the bound of the universe. Uranus is like, hell no, there's more to it. I'm going to break off of you and I'm going to show you. And then the sign of Taurus has that stable quality that doesn't want to do that. So there's tension between Uranus and Taurus, and Uranus conjunct Saturn in general or interacting with Saturn. So this is showing us something about certain rigidities in our lives from that earth sign of Taurus, which is fixed, and Saturn being a very rigid planet in a water sign that's movable, and with Uranus that wants to move and shake things up. Things are starting to have just enough movement for us to pivot, for us to adjust some things. It's also showing us because Saturn represents things that are old, because Saturn represents old age and longevity and things that endure. Same with the sign of Taurus. It's showing Uranus, look, man, things that are old, they're not necessarily obsolete. Maybe you just need to think outside the box the way you love to think outside the box and understand how to use that old material or medium to do this thing that you want to do. So Uranus is kind of learning here. And I'm saying Uranus is learning because Saturn's in the superior position. So it's almost like it's fathering Uranus at this moment, pun intended, if you know the mythologies. It's almost as if saying to Uranus, look, every tradition is not dead weight. There's something of value there. Can you just use that flexibility right now and just try to see what that is? Saturn's saying to Uranus, look, what if change is about reform and refinement and not about being this insane revolutionary person that you constantly want to be? Maybe you don't need to create that rupture and that break. And Saturn has to do with patience, right? And endurance. There's a sense of forbearance with Saturn. So Saturn could also be slowing Uranus down in a productive way, like telling Uranus, look, rebellion can take small increments of change where those small increments add up to something big. We're getting some sort of a wisdom about change and stability and the way that they can become the antithesis of each other a lot of time. But what if we can make this work? That's what this sextile is trying to say. And Saturn coming from that depth of Pisces, Pisces represents knowledge. It can reveal some deeper truth to us. This might also be a moment of reflection of us really wanting to change things, but Saturn saying, what is the underlying reason for why you want to change? Like, do you actually want to make something more refined, cultivated, and better? Or do you just want to escape discomfort of where you're at right now? Because Uranus can do that kind of changing. Like, you have a revolution to change what is because you don't like it, but you don't have the slightest inclination what you're having a revolution for. Like, where are you going? It's like, let me break it now. As long as it doesn't exist, I'm free from it. But is that freedom? Often in our human lives is not. Freedom often comes within bounds because we know where we're going, what we're fighting for, what our stance is. And I feel that Saturn is imparting that knowledge to Uranus. And, these could be small things. They don't need to be huge life things. Depends on your own chart placements, things of that nature. But it could be as simple as how you handle money, your finances. How do you proceed with that? Maybe you want to make some changes regarding that. Maybe you want to change some aspects of your health pertaining to your nutrition and food intake. And we got to do these things in small increments. We have big ideas. That Mercury that's sitting in the sign of Pisces, like, I'm going to do it big. It's distorted thoughts, but you incrementally change one thing every day. Within 30 days, it has added up. You're more fit. You have more money in your bank account, things of that nature. So whenever we talk about transits, they don't have to be fireworks. That's something to remember. But these small changes in life sometimes shift our direction bit by bit. We might be facing this way. Tomorrow we're like this, then like this, then like this. And within 5 years, we're actually going on a completely different direction. It's good to reflect and notice these things. And that's what the moon in the sign of Cancer, all of the self-inventory that it's evoking, is helping us understand. So now we go to the next set of alignments still on April 4th. We have Mars also sextiling Uranus at 24 degrees. So you can see what's coming up next. It's going to be Mars and Saturn trining too. So we'll talk about that after. So considering that Mars, again, is a sextile, so it's a supportive kind of an aspect, and it's going to do that trine, which is also another supportive aspect. And trines are like Jupiter's quality. They're giving the thing a kind of a blessing to go forth. And Mars in the sign of Cancer, what it needs the most right now is emotional intelligence to know how to act, to be strategic with foresight. But again, we can't just expect Mars to have this quality in the sign of Cancer because it's debilitated. The poor guy's really struggling and has been for a while. And because it has been struggling, we're also more prone to emotional reactivity. Like the same struggle comes up again. The first time we might be like, eh. The second time we're like, what the hell? Third time is like, hell no. Fourth time, we just want to beat someone up. That's what I mean about Mars' struggle at this point. So it can cling, it can defend, it can lash out. It feels threatened with the things that he is, but we might feel that way. Things that we might usually overlook, we're being more unforgiving at this point because we've been hit so many times in the past few months. So considering Saturn here is tempering that reactivity of Mars with that trine aspect. So Saturn's imparting the sense of maturity to Mars now because Saturn represents maturity. And then that sextile to Uranus, Uranus is like, hey, buddy, don't worry about it. Like I have some creative, innovative way of how we can pivot around the same problem. And I was saying because the moon is there and the moon is also having this moment where it's like Mars is confidant and this simultaneous conversation with Saturn and Uranus with Mars. It's almost Mars or us coming to realize that, okay, what I'm fighting for, does it really matter? Is this what I want to fight for? Or am I just fighting for change out of habits, out of reactivity? We're starting to understand how to choose our battles too. We might have been fighting so many and so overwhelmed by it. And that's what Mercury might be doing in the sign of Pisces, just going over through all of this and combing through and being overwhelmed. But these two other planets are helping us here to have a sense of clarity about what are we fighting for? What are we reactive for about? And I know we might have been, and especially at this time, feel very pressured to make a decision because of that eclipse that happens, whether it was an ending or a new beginning. And it could be about our loved ones. It could be related to our home living situation, our relationships that are more intimate, like family dynamics, or even how we feel about our country, the nation. But if we take this moment to pause and reflect, we'll come to see the outcome that we're trying to reach is important, but so is the way that we act along the way. And having small acts with clarity, even if they don't feel like they're so impactful, like the way Mars wants to conquer, can be way more effective than these big gestures and these big actions that in reality will fall apart because it doesn't have a proper application, or it doesn't correspond to our inner authentic sense of self. And this is important, again, because of that eclipse in Aries. Aries is about individuation. Who are you in the truth of who you are? So we need to come to these realizations to be able to align our actions to the right things. And a lot of our actions could have been from a place of panic in the past few months because of where Mars was. This is just like assessing, okay, I'm having the same feeling. I feel the urge to react in the exact same way. I did not get a good outcome last time. What do I need to do? Has that kind of a feel. And something wants to change because of that Uranus component. Something needs to budge here. Something needs to pivot. But Saturn's bringing that patience and maturity, and Moon is being supportive right now because it's in its own sign. It has a lot of strength and dignity. So now just to wrap up April 4th, just to give you a summary. First and foremost, this is not the week to believe everything you think, hear, or passes through your mind. Like that Mercury-Rahu conjunction, I cannot overemphasize the distortion of it because Mercury is in very low dignity. Mercury is suffering. Mercury is not supported in the sign of Pisces. Mercury already has information overload, has knowledge overload because the sign of Pisces represents just the depth of things and everything's incorporated, and Mercury deals with sections and segments and small pieces and brings this small piece in relation to this small piece. This is like little Mercury has to bring Atlantic Ocean and Pacific Ocean into relation with each other instead of bringing this droplet of water with that droplet of water into relation to create that nexus. So Mercury is overwhelmed. So our thoughts, the things that Mercury represents, they're being challenged. And Mercury represents our communication, our thinking process, our friendship, our sense of symmetry and balance, our sense of diplomacy, how we deal with other people. And Mercury is a very flexible planet in general, is of the air element. So in itself, in its own nature, it doesn't have stability and sustainability like a thought. It comes, it goes. So we have to be careful of what comes and what goes, because we're getting amplified to feel very real, but that realness is an illusion that Rahu's creating. But I talk about this in the other video that I'm keep referring you guys to. Rahu's very intelligent. Rahu likes to decode information. And Mercury is about decoding information. So we could also have the capacity to do that right now, but there's a lot to decode. So no matter how we flip this coin, there's overwhelm on this April 4th. And with Mercury actually going to about mid-April, as I was describing, they're going to stay very close to each other. And I think one way to go around this distorted discernment, it's not to keep looping around, is this thing true? Who the hell knows if anything's true on the best day when Mercury is exalted? There are multiple of truths in life with any circumstance. But what we can ask ourselves so that it can ground us, and Mercury needs grounding in the sign of Pisces, is to understand what's useful. And that Saturn-Uranus conjunction, with those small increments of change that they're promoting and they're supporting to happen, we need to know what's useful. With that self-inventory that's happening with Mars, we're trying to understand what's useful to us at this point now. So by understanding, gearing our mind up to understand not what's true and what isn't true, but what's useful, what's rooted, what's grounded, what is practical. And Saturn and Mercury are not yet conjunct, but again, they're roommates in that same sign, right? So there's some flare of Saturn coming through also. So we can focus on that. We can meditate on that to actually ask Saturn for some help in this sense too. So this day, this first part of the week is not about silencing or everything on the inside or in our head, but it is about recognizing which parts are really just noise and which parts actually deserve our real attention. We have to be very like Saturn stingy almost, or practical, to use a better word, with where we invest our attention right now. Because if things are changing, if we had endings with that eclipse and we have new beginnings, it's like going to driving school for the first time. Something's just beginning, something that you don't necessarily know how it works. You really have to give it your full attention, not to crash and not to make a lot of mistakes that can be devastating with long-term effects. And I think there has to be a transmutation of emotions to intentions this week. This is one of the components that we're going through. So it's about when we're going internal and we're touching base with that internal landscape, it's good to let the emotions inform us and not to control us. And the way emotions and thoughts control us is that we believe them. We believe that they are the truth with a capital T. And this is something we have to stay mindful with, especially since it's demanding of us to have that gaze turn inwards. So I'm going to leave it here for April 4th. I'm going to come back in a day or two to give you guys the transits for April 6th, which falls into that first week of April still. And just to give you guys a heads up of what I'm going to talk about, for April 6th, Sun at 16 degrees of Aries is going to sextile Jupiter in the sign of Gemini. And on that same day, Venus at 25 degrees of Pisces is going to trine Mars in the sign of Cancer. And before signing off, if I could say there's one planet this month really worth examining, exploring, contemplating, meditating on, keeping it close to our heart in a very devoted manner, is Venus. Because both new moon and full moon will be happening in the signs that belong to Venus, both Taurus and Libra this month. Venus is exalted. Whatever harsh aspects that we get, Venus is somehow mediating it in the middle, softening the blows. So if you want to understand the essence of Venus, what Venus is in nature, what Venus is in our own nature as an archetype, as an existential function. This is a good month to cast our gaze on Venus and just to see how it's operationalizing itself in our lives. And on a last note, everything that I discussed, I perhaps should have said this at the beginning, is that look where the sign of Pisces, Taurus, and Cancer are falling in your charts. Those houses are the ways these planets are going to negotiate themselves, which means with the themes of those houses, with the kind of people that pertain to those houses. So that's a very important thing every time we talk about transits to keep in mind. And I should remember to say this at the outset so you guys can cast your imagination and your vision while I'm doing the talk on your chart and those aspects of your life. But that's it for today. And I will be back, as I said, to discuss April 6th. Sending you much love. Till next time.